So what I want to talk about is sort of issues of systems and levels of scale. So as you know, I'm a social psychiatrist, and so when I started, and I talk about this in the Main Street introduction that you got, uh, I was writing a paper about skin color in the development of identity, and this paper was basically based on short stories by Jessie Fawcett. Now, these stories, Jessie Fawcett was an African American writer, part of the Harlem Renaissance, and these stories are rather obscure. And the reason I knew about them was that I once had a summer job working for my professor, Dr. Herbert Aptheker, a leading scholar in African American history. And my job was to check a bibliography of the published papers of W.B. Du Bois. So, but a lot of these publications were in the Crisis, the Journal of the National Association of Colored People, NAACP. Um, and so I had to go through issues of the Crisis. And in the course of going through that, I read other things that were in the Crisis and other publications, and that's how I came across these stories by Jessie Fawcett. So I just loved these stories and sort of the issue of skin color and how it was dealt with was there. And so I had the idea that I would write a reflection on it. This was when I was just beginning as a psychiatric resident. But a colleague of mine said, doctors will never read this because it's not enough about medicine, which is an issue that I confront in my work to this day, hasn't changed. And he said, why don't you link it to the biopsychosocial model of George Engels? I said that made perfect sense because certainly the issue of color, a person has skin of a certain color, but that is related to what's going on in the family, what's going on in the community, what's going on in the nation. And so what I did was look at what happened in these stories by Jessie Fawcett and relate it to what was going on at all these levels of scale. So that was how I got started. And basically, the idea that there are these levels of scale, that there are these systems, and that these systems are um, so of different sizes, right? So the biosphere, or imagine the galaxy, or all the galaxies, is much larger than the person. So thinking at this way, like what's going on and thinking about them simultaneously has been the core of how I've studied everything I've studied from that beginning. Now, doctors don't think about it that way. Doctors really think from the person down. And this is what Engels was critiquing back in 1980. Um, but this has continued to be the dominant model. In fact, it's gotten, even more focused on what's going on at the molecular level, what's going on in the DNA. Not even at the organ system level, but way down at the molecular level. So my work really basically went in the other direction, which was to say that we know that disease is in the person, but the person is in the two-person system, the family system, the community system, etc. So how could you think about that? And what was going on in those other systems? And this was very important to me because I wanted to think about issues like racism. What did racism do to mental health? And I'm totally not unique. Every Black psychiatrist thinks about racism a lot and writes about it. So, how are you supposed to handle it? How are you supposed to think about it? It's a very, very pressing issue. So, in a way, as they say, this is where I'm coming from, is how do you think about complexity at multiple levels of scale? And part of it is that this means that you have to look around. So um, I landed in Harlem, Washington Heights, Harlem in 1990, after having started doing AIDS research in 1986 in San Francisco. And at that time, Harlem was really just devastated by years and decades, really, of disinvestment. A colleague of mine, Leslie Rennis, took this photo, 145th Street looking south, and you can see that all of the buildings on the side of the street, on the left-hand side of the street, are boarded up, and there's trash and pathetic little trees. And basically, the store is selling, cigarettes and things like that. So this this is a classic photo of Harlem in that moment in time. But it was not unique in African American communities. So this is a photo from Pittsburgh. I did a lot of work in Pittsburgh in the Hill District. So this is a story of Pittsburgh Hills District, which had also suffered grievously from disinvestment. This is a photo by Helen Stummer, a great photographer who did a lot of work in Newark. And this is a photo of a young man who's taking clothes home to his mother. But the home is the cardboard shack, not even a building. Now, this devastation was everywhere, African American countries, neighborhoods all across the country. And so, how to think about this, how to think about what had happened. What I knew was that it hadn't always looked like this. So, people who were not familiar with the neighborhoods would say, well, they were always poor ghettos, right? The whole idea of a dark ghetto is a very well established old trope. But whatever the dark ghetto was, it wasn't this. So, so the sort of piecing that apart and thinking about it, and if it wasn't this and it had collapsed, what did that mean? That's the work that I've been doing for my career. And one of the things that became obvious was it didn't become obvious quickly, but it became obvious over time, was that the kinds of African American neighborhoods that you can see depicted again all across the country as stable, energetic communities had gone through a long process of many kinds of harms. If you read Shelter Force newsletter and magazine, their headline in their newsletter today was it's too easy to blame redlining. And if you see where redlining is, so the segregation exists, redlining comes in and codifies it, but it's not the beginning or the end of the problems of the neighborhood. So we're in a great burst of scholarship around redlining, which is very useful and important, but it can be too simplistic. So what else happens? So the major urban renewal program, deindustrialization, Hope 6, gentrification, mass incarceration, the foreclosure crisis, and planned shrinkage, all these things happen, and and one after the other, so that there are a series of disasters, and none of them are fully mitigated. So the communities are being torn apart, and before they can repair, they're torn apart again, and before they can repair, they're torn apart again. And so what you see in 1990 in Harlem is the result of that process. And one of the striking statistics when I first got there in 1990 was a paper by Drs. McCord and Freeman, who pointed out that an African American man living in Harlem had a shorter life expectancy than did a man in Bangladesh, which was at that time one of the poorest countries on earth. It was just a really shocking statistic. But when you walked around Harlem and you looked at what had happened to a once intact, vibrant, fabulous neighborhood, it you could say, well, something terrible happened. All these things happened. It took us a while to figure out the all, because people do like to say, well, this happened, or it's segregation, or it's redlining, or it's this, or it's that. But in fact, it's all these things. And so some of it has been, how does such a series of disasters affect a community, and what do we do next? So one of the papers that I most greatly admire and think everybody should read is a paper by Eva Marie Sims. She published in the Humanistic Psychologist on childhood in the Hill District. She's a phenomenologist, and she'd been studying childhood in other Pittsburgh neighborhoods. And she wanted to know what happened in the Hill, like just to contrast, another stable neighborhood. But what she heard from people when she went and interviewed them was different from what she anticipated. And that really, I think, is one of the hearts of science, is that we always have ideas. We're always making predictions, right? You have a theory, you make a prediction, and it's either true or it's not. But being able to say, oh, I was completely wrong, or this wasn't what I expected to hear, that is really when we make discoveries. And she made such a discovery. And what she describes is she says, listen, segregation and what was happening to the communities was a part of childhood in a way that in white people's childhoods they weren't talking about these things. No, she describes three periods, which I call Sims 1, Sims 2, and Sims 3. In the first period, which she talks about as being between 1930 and 1960, there's a really tight functioning
Mhm.
community. And this photo by Teenie Harris of this marching band.
Nu taip, taip. Teisingai, taip ir reikia daryti.
Hello, somebody. It is an example of the kind of vibrant life that people had going on. The, the second period is 1960 to 1980, and it's ushered in by urban renewal, a huge amount of urban renewal that was done in Pittsburgh. And uh, so it wiped out the downtown part of this district, this neighborhood, the Lower Hill, which was the commercial center. So a huge amount of the life of the neighborhood was destroyed. The third period is 1980 to 2004. And the point is that by the time they got to that, and I started to visit the hill in 1997, it wasn't even, of course, you couldn't visit the lower hill. That wasn't part of the neighborhood anymore. That had been taken by urban renewal. But the middle hill had been devastated by all these policies. And, it's just chaos. So people talk about not knowing what to expect when you went out on the streets, as opposed to in Sims 1, people say we knew each other, the neighbors knew us, they'd look out for us. And then it's much different than it is now. We weren't afraid of anything. So this is the massive shift. And as we were able to lay out, as we studied the history of these neighborhoods, urban renewal tore the neighborhood apart, but then deindustrialization eliminates the jobs. Drugs become the new employer, and the drug epidemics take off. And the epidemics are ignored as epidemics, they're treated as crime. And this begins an era of mass incarceration. These are the layers and layers and layers that we're looking at. So the one of the things I think is so important is that it's not like all of a sudden America woke up and said, "Oh, let's don't be a racist country. Let's be sensible." Because as we know, we're going into this crisis. We're deep in this crisis of climate change and it, unable to act, really, literally, quite frozen. So at this moment, as a country that tore apart its cities, targeting African Americans, but really affecting everybody, what we see is I found this so well summarized by Emily Badger and Niraj Chokshi in the New York Times that politicians who were saying, let's don't have partisan hostility, uh, that but that doesn't change anything. They they quote this Stanford political scientist who said, if you go back to the days of the Civil War, one can find cases in American political history where there was far more rancor and violence. But back in the Civil War, but in the modern era, there are no ifs and buts. Partisan animus is at an all-time high. So that not only are we tearing apart African American neighborhoods, which is well documented, but the ripple effects of this are affecting everyone in the nation. And our nation has become a fractured place where people are fighting with one another. So as a psychiatrist, and as a social psychiatrist, I've had the opportunity to say, well, what do we do about it? We have a whole nation that's crazy. What can we bring to the party as psychiatrists? What can I bring to the party to try to make it better? And so one of the things I quickly learned was that if I was going to work at these higher levels of scale, not just study them, if I was going to work at the level of the family, I had to learn the rules of families. Families' systems are different from individual systems. So part of my residency was learning how to do family therapy and work with family systems. And that was a huge treat, very exciting, very complicated. My supervisors, I had a lot of direct supervision where they would be watching through a one-way mirror. And they would say, but don't you see the order of behaviors, how the family system works? I didn't see it all. It took a long time of them pointing out to me. We videotaped a lot of our work so that we could replay it and see the exact progression. And the sort of classic: dad comes home from work mad, he hits mom, mom hits the kid kicks the dog, and that's how the family operates. So, but there are higher levels of scale than that, and so how do you work at those? So the Roderick Wallace and Deborah Wallace have written a very important paper called Magic Strategies. And they say, look, if you're going to work at these higher levels of scale, you have to work in multiple systems and multiple levels of scale. And this is an example of schistosomiasis, which is a very important parasite that infects millions of people, but which has a very complicated life cycle, which includes people, but also includes the water and snails. So you can't just treat infected people, because then all the parts of the schistosome that are in all these other life stages are there to reinfect them. So you've got to provide a complex of treatments. You've got to treat people, we have medicines for that, but you've also got to provide clean water, and you've also got to kill the snails. So it's this multiple phases, multiple systems. You really got to understand what's going on in order to intervene in a way that will be strong and appropriate and sufficiently complex to respect the organism that you're up against. Very, very complicated organism. So this is what they call a magic strategy. So multi-system, multi-scale health promotions, they say, fit best with the basic biology of people and offer the most hope for the future. So these are interventions that address the large-scale social inequalities and injustices, are sensitive to local culture, and include the voices of all the people. So how do you start to think about this? So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've worked on, which I wouldn't call magic strategies, because I just learned about magic strategies much later, but which helped me have respect for these higher levels of social systems so that I could begin to think about what is a magic strategy. And of course, my work really begins when I met Michel Cantal-Dupart, famous French urbanist and architect, at Coloc Truville in 1993, a long time ago. So next year will be 30 years since I met Cantal. He, at this conference, was giving the opening plenary, and he said, for a long time, I have been trying to mobilize our leaders so that the cities, where our money and brain power are concentrated, innovate for better functioning. What is the problem we must solve? It is the fracture that exists between the wealthy neighborhoods and the others. But paradoxically, if we want to improve life in those neighborhoods, we can't just treat the neighborhoods, we must treat the whole city. We must eliminate the fracture. So this is really the beginning of saying, of me as a psychiatrist, saying, oh, okay, I don't actually even know what a city is. So I have to learn what a city is. And Cantal took me on as a student, and I have traveled with him over all the years in between. But this idea that if you want to treat the problem in the neighborhood, you actually have to treat the city. This was revolutionary and is the exact parallel, but at a higher level of scale, of what I had been taught in family therapy. In family therapy, the parents come in with an acting out adolescent, and they say, fix the kid. But really, it turns out when you talk to the whole family that the parent's marriage is falling apart. Dad's having an affair or something like that. And that's how it comes to be that the toddler is acting out. So you have to fix the whole system, but the problem is not the toddler. The problem is the system. And my new dog, um, the is very badly behaved. But I am the sort of pack leader. The problem is to fix me as a pack leader, not just to yell at him. So that is what the systems, the trainer who's working with me, and she's working with me to get me to do the right things to change the dog's behavior. Um, so this is Cantal. A couple years ago when we went to visit the Nantes Memorial to the abolition of slavery. Um, and so I wanted to talk about three examples of this, which are at different levels of scale: the Student Success Network, Family to Family, Climb City Life is Moving Bodies, which is our parks project, and 400 Years of Inequality. Um, so to start, Student Success Network. So when I was a medical student, I really struggled at first until a professor of mine said, you don't know what you're doing, do you? And I said, no, I haven't the foggiest idea. And he said, well, this is what you have to do. So he explained it to me, and after that, I didn't have any trouble. So when I learned about a model from Uri Treisman had invented at UC Berkeley to help Black and Hispanic students who were failing calculus at UC Berkeley. And his model was that there are no high risk students, there are only high risk classes. And when you have a high risk class, what you have to do is support the students so that they can handle it. And this made perfect sense to me because that was what had happened to me. Once I had support and I was oriented to what was needed, I didn't have any problem in medical school. So, could we adapt Treisman's model to prevent excess failure among minority students? And so, I first had a grant to do this at UCSF, and then when I went to Columbia, I was able to do it there. And basically, we were able to pre- eliminate all preventable failure. What I mean by preventable is there was a kid whose grandmother had raised him and she died the day before medical school started. And he failed. And that was really difficult. But so I think that there's some things like acts of God that are just throw people off so badly that they're going to have a hard time in school. And that's fine. But everything else is preventable. So the Student Success Network, which is what we call the program at Columbia, not only eliminated all this preventable failure, but it actually shifted the culture. Um, and partly that was because Josh Gibson, who later became a psychiatrist in California, pioneered team training and help everybody learn how to function in teams. And actually, the whole team orientation became so important that we started to hire people who had been on teams. And not as many women at that point had been on teams, but they had been in choirs or something like that where they worked with a group and they'd been the head of it. And those people really knew how to get a group to work together. And once the groups were able to work together, the transfer of knowledge from the second year students to the first year students went very smoothly. So this both programs, Medical Scholars Program at UCSF and SSN, are still going on. Um, and that's so Medical Scholars Program started in 1986 and SSN in 1991. So they've been able to continue and continue to do this kind of keeping the culture oriented towards teams, friendly, warmer. I don't know that people would want to say it's friendly, but certainly warmer than it was when we started. The the second program that I wanted to talk about is Family to Family. So one of the heads of the Student Success Network was Josh Chipman, and he was talking about something. And we were having a meeting, and he said, "Well, I'm a Mormon, Church of Latter-day Saints, and this is how we handle that." And he had so much good advice. I said, "Could you tell me where do you get all this good advice?" He said, "Oh, I get it from the church. This is how the church operates." And so one of the things that he taught me about was Family Home Evening, which is a church program to strengthen all the families. And based on an observation they had that TV was moving in and taking over the home, and they didn't want people to lose the coherence of the family. So they invented this thing, Family Home Evening, which is done by Mormon families throughout the world. And Monday evening, there are no meetings of the church. People are supposed to be home with their families. And they do this family home evening process. So it's basically 7 steps. And we, with their help, um, adapted it for use with a group of families in Harlem. So the 7 steps are an opening, a song, some discussion of family business, a lesson, an activity, refreshments, and a closing. And this was we did this as a multifamily group, but also taught each of the individual families how to do this at home. And so it was sort of how do you help families that are under a lot of pressure, have very few resources, maintain their spirits and help one another. So this was a project that we worked on for quite a few years, led by Leslie Rennis, who's now at Borough of Manhattan Community College. And Molly Kaufman helped with this, writing this book. Molly Kaufman is now the co-director of the University of Orange, which I'll talk about a little bit. Um, so, so medical schools or schools as systems are different from families as systems, and certainly different from how would you gather all the families in a neighborhood? Could you do that? But the question that we looked at in City Life is Moving Bodies and Climb is can you improve parks? So the park that was right near our offices in Washington Heights is called Highbridge Park. And Highbridge Park had basically been disinvested by the Parks Department. They actually put a kind of iron railing, and then to the west of the iron railing was maintained, and to the east of the iron railing was abandoned. And that's where homelessness was. There were this boxing matches went on there. People would put cars in there, all kinds of things that didn't have a place in the city went on there. So, but it was beautiful, beautiful parks. So could these parks be restored to the neighborhood? And it turns out that there was more than one of these cliffside parks. So we thought, can we connect the neighborhoods, and could we make a trail? So one of the things that we did at first was just walk the parks. So this is Joseph Sanchez and Lourdes Rodriguez and Molly Kaufman and I, and we were there with Rod Wallace, who is both our guru in magic strategies, but also a great photographer, looking at the parks. And you can see these stairs on the right are in ruins, but you can also see we're just having such a great time. It was so beautiful, and we just loved walking there because there are a lot of places in Highbridge Park you have no sense you're in Manhattan. You think, oh, I'm in the Adirondacks. I really liked going to the Adirondacks for half an hour and then going back to my office. It's very delightful. So Lourdes Rodriguez was very much the leader of this project and brought together, built a coalition of community organizations, uh, very much based in Washington Heights, which is where we were located and where her networks were, but with not as dense, but some connections to Harlem and and also very dense connections in Inwood. So because the park started at Central Park and ran all the way to the cloisters. And the task of this coalition became advocating for these parks, but the way we did it was to have a party every year. That was called Hike the Heights. And the idea was that people would hike from wherever they were to the party site. And so that's 2005. And then you see 2011. The stairs have been rebuilt. And so that's the beginning, really, of reinvestment in the parks. And as you know, now the city committed to restore the High Bridge, which connects Bronx to Manhattan at the level of the High Bridge Park. And these stairs were put in as part of that reconstruction. And so now the High Bridge is reconnected and is a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous place to walk and just hang out. So along the way out of these experiences, I was able to accomplish the task of naming the elements of urban restoration, which is what my book Urban Alchemy is built around. And it's an interesting task to say, I've seen what I said to myself was I've seen a lot of projects. I've traveled in France, I've traveled in the United States, I've met with so many people. What is it that they do? And then can I identify the acts, the orientations that they have in common? And so the first task was for me was to review, what I had seen. And then the second was to see if I could propose what I thought were common elements in their work. The third was to review them. And then the final task was to develop the periodic table of the elements of urban restoration, which is this. So sort of the work of Student Success Network and Family to Family and Climb are really can we learn the rules of these systems, and then can we state what are some of the rules, some of these principles. So these are 9 elements of urban restoration. I don't think that they are that this is the entirety of elements of urban restoration, but just 9 that I've seen. One of the doctoral students that I'm working with now, who's working in Camden, she says she's a mini Mindy Fullilove, and she has some more elements of urban restoration that she's proposing. So it's cool. I assume people will go on inventing elements until we make all our cities great, God willing. So then at the next level of scale is 400 years of inequality. It's really a national project, a little bit international, um, which we started in 2016. And our goal was to create a call for organizations throughout the US to observe the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. So hundreds of organizations participated, and it helped to make 400 years, you know, a hard, when you think about the protests in after the murder of George Floyd, 400 years was one of the ways in which people expressed the weight of oppression that they were protesting against. I was able to work with 2 classes at New School to make this timeline. Um, and we did it by following events in African American history, women's history, Native American history, and working people's history. And this timeline is available on our website, 400yearsofinequality.org, and it has been all over the world. And in fact, the New School celebrated its centennial in 2019. And this timeline is one of the items that was put into a time capsule to be opened in 100 years. I wanted to show you a little bit of one of the observances. Stop the share of this. How are you guys holding up? All I see are blank screens. Is anybody out there? Oh, Jocelyn, I see a face. Oh, Jacob, excellent. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. It's very intimidating, you know. I have this quick time, but can I see it if I want to share my screen? I gotta click those buttons. So my hometown is Orange, New Jersey, and I'm part of an organization called the University of Orange, which is a free people's university that we started 13 years ago. And so we participated in the 400 Years of Inequality project and also organized in Orange. We do an annual concert called Remembering Rosa, a concert for peace in honor of Rosa Parks. And it's typically on December 1st, which is the day that she refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. So some of the kids that you'll see in this performance have actually been performing at this Remembering Rosa concert for years.
Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna, yeah, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody. I'm gonna, marching up to freedom, man. Ain't gonna let segregation turn me round. up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let injustice turn me round. Yeah. Turn me round. Whoa. Turn me round. Ain't gonna let injustice turn me round. Yeah. Keep on. Marching up to freedom land. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let racism turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let racism. I'm gonna keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. I'm gonna let Mississippi turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking. I'm gonna keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. I'm not gonna let hatred turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. I'm not gonna let hatred turn me round. Keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me. Ain't gonna let nobody. I'm gonna keep on marching. I'm gonna keep on walking.
So one of the things that I talk about in my book Main Street, a major thing is the method that I learned and used for doing the Main Street project. And it's a method that I learned from Hirofumi Minami, a Japanese environmental psychologist who did a number of visits in New York and became a great friend of mine. And he was also a great friend of David Chapin, who is also a friend of mine. And the three of us, you can see the team um, in that top photo, decided we would do a series of visits to Broadway. And he said the method is that we take a stroll, we go for a walk, and then we make a scroll. So this is sort of a draft of the Broadway scroll that's in my book. And he said that part of the issue is that what we do is we go and see, and then we free associate to what we saw. So after we had done these 5 walks that we did between 2012 and 2013, we came back to David's office, and Hero brought in all these things for us to look at. For example, the children's book, Here's New York, which talks about Wall Street being originally a wall built to keep the Indians out. And then we had obviously walked Wall Street, walked Lower Broadway, um, And for example, seeing the granite memorials for all the famous people, all the people deemed famous. So these are some of the associations. And one of the reasons this is important is that it you know this free association allows you to take in what's going on and then connect it to what you're seeing and where you're going and what's happening. So the University of Orange decided that this was really a useful tool for all the work that is going on in Orange. And as part of the Main Street launch activities, which they very kindly hosted for me, people went and walked main streets and shared what they saw. So Sandina Ahmed walked this part of Bloomfield Avenue near her home, and Alex Gabriel, who everybody was in different places, but Alex Gabriel was working on the Biden campaign and was in Washington D.C. and so walked this part. Um, and our colleague Robert, who lives up in Bradhurst section of Manhattan, walked around there. And so I'm currently serving on the American Institute of Architects board, and I suggested to them that they do a national book group to teach design thinking so that people will have tools for designing the future. And the book I suggested that they have people read is this old book, RSVP Cycles, by Lawrence Halpern, because it's so 60s, and that kind of makes it very relevant to today. It's not like last year's book where everybody has an opinion. It's a 60s book, and it's so cool. Who could say it's not cool? You just can't. So I'd like to stop there and stop the share. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm not sure what happens next, Jacob or Jocelyn.
Next, we have just Q&A, which you can moderate as you will. People can use their mechanical hands.
Terrific.
I guess I'll start. And this is you know, in line with a question that the seminar has been asking pretty much all of our speakers. You mentioned early on in your talk that you had to learn what a city is. So what is a city?
Well, Michel Cantal-Dupart works in the southwest France in many small villages. So we're in the small village. I said, you're an urbanist, you work in cities, why are you working here? And he's like, well, there's a French historian who said a city is a place with two bakeries. And one time, my family and I stayed in a very small town, Non-les-Pins, not Juan-les-Pins, but Non-les-Pins in Provence, and it had two bakeries. So when he said two bakeries, I really, you had a choice, but you picked one, or we tried both, and then we picked one, and we stuck with that one. But everybody stuck with their bakery. So it's about choice. I think in America, a city could be any place with two churches or two denominations. But it could also be the First Baptist, Second Baptist. I think that would count in America. So that's what a city is. I know people get into oh, a city is a place with 30,000 people. But as a social psychiatrist, it's much more interesting to me that a city is a place where people have choices. Is that the answer everybody gives you?
We've not heard the churches or bakeries answer, so no.
Oh, good,
But
good.
that's
And
far
now,
more. It's actually far more concrete than most of the answers that we've got.
yeah, people get hung up on things like numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are you going to do?
I think that's a really interesting way of just kind of piggybacking on that response and thinking about
the idea of choice. And so many times urban is used, the word urban is used in research. I'm thinking about education. My background is in special ed. And it's used as a word that's code for something else, which generally means no choice. Especially when you think about the way that it's used to modify schools and the way that the hidden meaning is sort of low quality or problematic schools. And I'm wondering if how you think about like the other uses of the word, if that resonates with you at all, or how people sort of look to the use of the word urban in research as an identification of some kind of problem, maybe meaning no choice or maybe meaning some other hidden meanings. I mean, urban and city aren't synonyms, but maybe started out sort of as such.
I think you're right that, urban youth means Black kids or Latin kids, right? But, you know, I've been pretty busy, so I don't think I've paid too much attention to that debate um, at all. So, you- if, yeah, sort of not something I've worried about. I'm always intimidated when everybody has turned off their cameras. It really makes me feel weird. Like,
Yeah, thank you for saying that. If everyone could turn them on, that'd be great.
it's really hard to have a conversation with people's names.
So another question topic that oh, someone has a question in the chat.
Somebody else has a dog.
Question?
Yeah, please.
First of all, I really enjoyed the whole presentation. I love that you combine so many different media to give us a sense of your work and your thoughts. And I do some research of my own, particularly in education and education equity. And I've been a resident of the Lower East Side for 30 years, and I'm always walking around and I'm always finding new and different little places that there's just such a density and a wealth of sort of spaces and places in New York City that I find so interesting, and they're constantly changing. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you've done any work or if you've looked at things like schools as anchors of identity in communities, particularly in New York City, and also as schools and education and sort of the change that the policymakers have in terms of identifying who can go to what schools and how where you live affects where you go to school, and sort of that how those things sort of either coalesce or maybe even contradict each other in terms of schools as part of a community, but then also people commuting and traveling from one neighborhood to go to another neighborhood or whatnot. And I'm just curious if you've had any work or research or thoughts about that as an identity, especially in urban communities that are so thick and rich with so many different people and languages.
I haven't done a lot of work on that, but my interest in the psychology of place is grounded in school desegregation in my town. When I was 7 years old, so that I moved from what was then the black school to the white school, and I was profoundly traumatized by it, which is why I became a psychiatrist. But then psychiatry didn't explain to me why I should have been so traumatized, so then I had to study the psychology of place. So I got to where I am today because of school desegregation. Um, the so I know these are big issues. And
Mhm.
therefore, I don't even want to touch it. It's so complicated. Like, yes, these are big issues.
Yeah, and I guess my question was not so much as to what your position might be on it, because I agree it's a very loaded, very fraught, but I guess it's just, to me, this sort of, and as neighborhoods change and the demographics change and you know, there's so many, almost like so many different choices, and then there's so many different attempts to create sort of, I don't know, sometimes forced identities or not. And I don't know, just, yeah, and I appreciate you, the fact that you're bringing in your own personal experiences to how these things impact your work, I think is also really meaningful. So thank you.
So my work is really grounded in the experience I had when I was a college student. My father, who was a labor and community organizer, was dying, and he was disabled because he'd had a series of strokes. But he really wanted to finish a book that had been on his mind for really decades. And so I was voluntold by the family that I would help him finish this book, which was, yeah, and I was in way over my head. It was very complicated to do this, but anyway, that's what we undertook. And a lot of the story had to do with the schools in Orange, New Jersey. And so it was sort of what the community organizers had encountered in facing problems of segregated schools, desegregating the schools. And basically, it became clear to them that that they weren't going to be able to desegregate the schools as a way of making progress, basically because of white resistance and white flight. That but that even if you desegregated the schools, the issue of how do you have quality education for all the kids was deeper and harder. And so I've always thought that was really the issue. So you could say that my work with the Student Success Network and Medical Scholars Program is really my effort to think, how can you make sure that everybody gets a quality education? So I think there's lots, whatever the school is and whatever its resources are, it can be a top quality school. We know this. There are tons of very, very deprived schools that produce fabulous numbers of scholars. So a school is a very unique and very complex institution. There are a couple of high schools, I don't think it's more than five, that were centers of Black education through segregation, and that fabulous numbers of accomplished people came out of that small number of high schools. There's just some confluence of people and philosophy and social systems. So the issue is, and this I think is the scientific question, is can we learn the rules of making a fabulous school? Everybody's trying to do, I mean, it's obviously a major topic in education, but can you learn the rules to that so that you could adapt it anywhere? Uri Treisman, who won a MacArthur Genius Award, rightly so, I think identified one of those rules, which is there are no high-risk students, there are only high-risk courses. I think that's a rule. If you applied that in every school, you'd see much more prosperity. So I think that's the scientific question. Is any school can be great. How do you make your school great? What are the rules? And I don't think we know all the rules yet. If that, I hope that's sort of an answer. That's how I think about it.
Thank you.
And I love being part of a free people's university because I believe all education should be free. I don't see any reason to have to pay, $40,000 or $50,000 in tuition when it's all on the internet. I think universities are nearly obsolete. So how do we make the move? How do we make the move into the next thing? So I love being part of a free university where we can work on that in that inventive space. And all of you are most welcome to come and teach at the University of Orange. It's a sort of, we believe everybody has something to teach and everybody has something to learn. Yeah, Kimberly?
Hey, so thank you for that. I've just been a huge fan of your work for forever. And I think we actually met out in New Jersey at one point. Um, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about repair. And so I was really taken by, the sequence of these sort of violent acts of destruction for urban and suburban areas that sort of unfold over a course of 20 to 30 years or so. Um, and then thinking about these moments and these attempts to kind of repair and reknit these communities. And I guess I'm sort of feeling impatient as I get older. Is there a way to kind of make the impact of repair kind of more widespread and faster, even as we're still living with the trauma of this destruction? And so is there, and maybe it's not, but I'm just sort of curious about what your thoughts are about how do we sort of jumpstart or or increase the pace of repair to these destroyed communities?
Well, it's not like the destruction is in the past. So now we're going through gentrification. In Orange, New Jersey, which has suffered from obviously segregation and redlining, then a highway was built through the center of town, and then deindustrialization hit the town very hard, followed, white flight, um, and then lots of immigration from really all over the world. So a whole new population trying to get to learn to live together, which is slowly happening. But now the powers that be have decided that the way to solve the problems of Orange, New Jersey is to basically have a bargain basement sale and sell the land to developers really cheap at a fraction of the real value of it, which will increase rents, push out the poor, and so gentrification, transit-oriented gentrification, which is a really major process in New Jersey. So the same thing that's happened to Harrison, that's happened to Hoboken, that's happened to Jersey City is now happening to Orange. So it's very active. It's happening right now that this land grab is going on. And it's actively promoted by the mayor and the city council, the business administrator. So they're not, it's not in the past, and that's why the communities can't recover. They can't recover because they keep getting hit. So why did Putin invade Ukraine? Because this is the madness of the ruling class. So how do we stop that? I don't have the answer. Even though I'm a psychiatrist. I don't know.
I mean, I guess if I could just sort of jump in and ask a follow-on question. I mean, I know that I'm not sure if it's even a debate, but there's a kind of unease about, whether or not having smaller scale attempts to repair neighborhoods, fixing a park, um, you know, doing something like that is in fact kind of almost setting the stage for gentrification. Um, and so I think for some community activists, there's a kind of a concern that, well, if we make it too nice, then somehow we're going to be sort of vulnerable to these gentrification processes.
Which is true. This friend of ours was doing a project in the black neighborhood in Jersey City, and she wanted the kids to clean up all the trash. She said, we have to clean up all the trash. And I was like, do you have an anti-gentrification plan in place? Leave the trash. Which I said half in jest. Like, don't stop the violence. Keep it violent. Tell the kids, go out and shoot buildings. Just make people scared to come. But this gentrification is international and has to do at this point with global movement of capital and very little to do with do we pick up the trash and clean up the neighborhood. And in the meantime, people are suffering because they can't go to the park. So clean up the park and do studies of international movements of capital. Figure out how do we control this. It's way bigger than we are. I think we can safely pick up the trash. It's not what's driving it. That make you feel better? No.
It's something.
Yeah, yeah. And it doesn't happen overnight. So in the years between when you clean up the park and when it happens, people have a nice park. That's certainly what we've seen in Highbridge, Morningside, St. Nicholas, Jackie Robinson parks, the parks of the Climb Trail. It's great to have the parks really reintegrated into the neighborhoods and be more functional.
I have a question that you already, I think, answered, but I'd love to hear if you have sort of further examples. When you mentioned in one of your discussions earlier in the presentation about it's not enough to treat a specific neighborhood or even a specific school, for example, but to treat the whole city. My original question was, I can think of what it means to treat a particular neighborhood or to invest in some kind of thing in that neighborhood. I'm a little bit less clear on what it means to treat the whole city. So I'm sort of curious about examples of that. And that was my original question, but I guess my sort of reframed question, is it sort of just a matter of perspective or the matter of the question that you asked? So in this example of schools that you gave, the question is not how do I improve education in this school, but how do I improve education for everyone? Is that sort of what it means to treat the city, or is it sort of something different? And are there other examples that you can provide of what that looks like?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's kind of the underlying thing of what I'm trying to say, which is that you have to learn the rules of at each level of scale. So if you say the problem of neighborhoods is at the level of the city, that's Cantel's proposition, then how does a city treat neighborhoods? So part of how the American city treats neighborhoods is that we stratify them by race and class, and then we distribute resources according to that stratification. So that's the problem of the neighborhoods. So that's what we have to treat. How do you undo that? He said the problem of the neighborhoods is fracture. There's a fracture between the wealthy neighborhoods and the poor neighborhoods. We are so profoundly fractured, we can't even talk to each other anymore. So how do you fix the fracture? Tom Hanchett described it as sorting the city by race and class in his classic book about Charlotte. And that's the concept that I adopted for my book, Urban Alchemy, that what we have to do is restore joy in America's sorted out cities. That's the problem we have to fix. So, but, so for schools, if you're going to fix the system of schools, part of it is, at least my father and his colleagues argued, you have to have the assumption that every school should be top notch. It's really the same with neighborhoods. Every neighborhood should be top notch. What if you say that? Every neighborhood should be fabulous. Why should there only be 2 cool neighborhoods or, 2 cool cities? How many cities do you think are cool in the United States? How many cities are there in the United States? Why can't they all be cool? They can all be cool. So can we start with that assumption? But we don't start with that assumption. So that's where the challenge is. Because if we say only some cities can be cool, then we're distributing resources, we're distributing coolness, and that's bad. I have to say you're a very serious looking group of people. So I'm sure you're listening intently. But I'm just really curious, what are you thinking? It's very intimidating. Tricia says, you bring a good point about the ambivalence of wanting clean parks and cafes in your neighborhood that have been without for so long. I don't want my neighborhood to become a destination or a place for investing overseas billionaires. Trust me, they've already bought your whole neighborhood. Don't worry about it. Have a cafe. What, you think the Lower East Side is not on their radar?
Well, I'm sorry, but I just have to mention, as you were talking, I don't know if you're familiar with, there's one of the few remaining parks in Manhattan that is publicly owned as the Lower East Side. And for years, they've been fighting over developing a plan to raise the park. And it's now the last neighborhood park, which, by the way, the Lower East Side has one of the highest densities of low and affordable housing left in the city. And it runs along the East River Park. And the park, what they've done now is they've basically demolished all of the trees. So when you go out there, it looks like it's horrible. It's just and the neighborhood, the people who live in the neighborhood, the people who depend on the park have depended on it throughout COVID, can't enjoy the park anymore because, and my guess is that it's because the city sold out to some very big developers who are building this, environmental, so-called environmental protection plan in order for them to then go ahead and develop commercial space and more billion-dollar co-ops and condos that will line the river. They will convert the NYCHA projects and they will turn them into something. So I'm sure there is something in the works beyond just developing, an environmental protection against the next flood. So that's as I'm listening to you speak, and I see it happening in my neighborhood, and it's very depressing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's bigger than most of us too. And that's the other piece of it too. It's, as you said,
Yeah.
It's happening at the very, very top levels.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's very depressing. I know that the schedule says that we meet again from 12 to 2 with the doctoral students in an informal conversation. Is that true, Jacob? Jacob said that.
Yeah, I was just gonna see if there are any other questions before we break, and then we'll come back at 1, and then have a unrecorded session with just the fellows. So any last questions, thoughts?
Well, it's been great to see all of you that I got to see, and hi to everybody whose name I got to know. And I'll see you shortly.